There.
Okay, well, thank you so very much, Patrick, for hosting and to all the Culinary Mind folks for organizing this and inviting me. I'm so honored to be here, and thanks to all of you who taking the time out of your day to join us. I'm in British Columbia right now, where it is 7 o'clock in the morning, which is the perfect time to be talking about wine, but not necessarily drinking it. So I do hope that all the Europeans, though, have plenty of wine near at hand. Um, let's start by talking about vintage. This is the concept that I want to do some theorizing around today. And we're going to offer a definition up from Jancis Robinson, the great British wine writer, in which she describes vintage as that physical process of grape picking or wine making. And she offers a second definition. It is the product of a single year and its weather. I'm going to offer a slightly different definition right up front. I understand vintage more as an encounter of human labor, tradition, and craft with climate. It's also that which is evaluated by trained tasters. As an academic tool, the process of tasting is analytical, evaluating human, creative, economic, artistic intent as it relates to the environment. Taste can be trained and it is communicated. It's also, and this is what I'm trying to argue today, an ecological sense. We can articulate new ways of engaging the practice of wine tasting as eco-criticism. That is, the social, political, and cultural diagnostic of the impact of the environmental crisis. But let's begin. Excuse me, that's early morning. Let's use vintage as we normally have as wine tasters to taste comparatively by tasting backwards in time. Wine tasters consider 2001 a good but not great vintage in Bordeaux in France. Unpredictable weather marked the growing season, beginning with a spring that only sluggishly transitioned from cold to warmth, and this hampered flowering and fruit set. By the time summer arrived, growers already knew that the grape yields were going to be reduced. Then periods of intense rain, punctuated by extreme heat, challenged ripening. And here's why. Rain at harvest dilutes flavors as grapes swell with moisture. In hot summer spells, sugars accumulate too quickly, and too much sugar will produce undesirably high alcohol levels. When grapes over-ripen, wine can lack the acidity that tasters associate with freshness and that wines need to be able to age. Commercial tasting happens at every stage of winemaking. Winemakers will sample fermented must and young wines from barrels. They'll taste again when they blend wines made from different grapes to produce a final bottling. As in most European appellations, a Bordeaux wine is sampled by an official tasting panel to determine if it meets the organoleptic profile of appellation laws, meaning it has the flavors, the tannins, the structural components of acidity, and more. Then, independent, trained, and accredited tasters evaluate the vintage. For this paper, I bought and tasted formally a bottle of Chateau Langoa Barton that you see here from the 2001 vintage, proving that I have a very good job. Chateau Langoa Barton is in the prestigious appellation of Saint-Julien on the left bank, the south shore of the Gironde River in the larger Bordeaux wine region. In 2001, the chateau's field workers began manually picking grapes on the 2nd of October and finished by 12 October. So a very short, compressed picking season. And remember this, the very fact that they still record those precise picking dates, and that's something we might return to in conversation. Throughout Bordeaux and at Langoa-Barton, harvest dates are advancing with the changing climate. In 2022, for example, a sweltering year marked by unprecedented fires in the nearby Landes forest, pickers at Langoa-Barton harvested from 8 to 23 September. And advancing harvests translate into changing tastes. In Bordeaux, appellation regulations permit producers to vary the percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and a handful of other varieties, and you can see what the blend was here for 2001. This has always been a climate adaptation, dating all the way back to the Middle Ages, when vintages varied around a norm. A higher percentage of earlier ripening Merlot, for example, can provide additional body and fruit character in cooler years when Cabernet Sauvignon struggles to ripen. However, as climate change departs from predictable fluctuations and threatens the variability of wineries to cultivate these varietals, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, winemakers in Bordeaux are scrambling, not simply to grow grapes, but to make wine that refers to the baseline expectations of Bordeaux. From the point of view of winemakers in vulnerable regions such as Bordeaux, and the region where I am here in British Columbia, distinctions between weather as short-term and climate, as conditions over a long period are dissolving. Weather is becoming climate, climate is becoming weather. Localized events like hail, scorching heat, late frosts, and forest fires are making wineries think less about seasonal patterns and more about climate change as the key variable in crafting vintage-dated wines. Very briefly, my tasting notes. The wine is deep garnet, demonstrating the wine's age. On the nose, the wine has a medium plus intensity, and fresh primary flavors have mostly disappeared with maturation. Cedar bark and pleasant smoke are hints of initial winemaking choices, including some new oak aging. Tasters would call these secondary notes. The wine's aromas of dried cherries, stewed raspberries, and brandied plums complement spice notes of dried ancho chilies and earthy aromas of black tea, dried mushrooms, and piney forest floor. This is why Europeans should have a glass of wine with them. Such tertiary notes show the effects of aging. On the palate, the wine is dry. It has a medium plus acidity, and I'm surprised that the high tannins remain so assertive despite almost a quarter century of aging. The winery picked the grapes before they became overripe, resulting in a wine with well-defined but not jammy or cooked fruit flavors. As a result, the alcohol is only medium, 12%, 12.5% ABV, alcohol by volume. But alcohol levels have been creeping upwards in recent vintages in Bordeaux, including at Langoa-Barton, and you see a 19th century image of the chateau here. If I were writing a tasting note on an exam or professionally to determine quality or price, I'd now consider how the various structural and sensory traits interact. However, today, I'm concerned with its market stature only to acknowledge wine as a cultural reference and valuable commodity. At this moment in tasting, sensory eco-criticism diverges from sensory commercial evaluation. The tasting, and I'll aggressively call it eco-tasting, that I'm proposing here consciously employs a language and rubric familiar to formal commercial wine evaluation. I'm tasting to gauge the intent of the winemaker in their relationship to climate and weather, and to understand the ways this aging wine provides a reference that determines contemporary style. I'm trying to open a dialogue between a labor practice of wine evaluation and a sensory approach to academic eco-criticism, which in the past really has considered how literature and other artifacts evoke sounds, smells, tastes, sights, and textures, and how these experiences can shape our understandings of nature and specifically the climate crisis. Eco-criticism, drawing from that sensory eco-criticism that I've defined, need not be restricted to the textual or visual as it has been in the past. I'm suggesting that we can deploy smell and taste as powerful tools for climate advocacy that can meaningfully engage customers, servers, winemakers, pickers. Wine, as vintage dated bottles, represents climate data that we can usefully compare to ice core samples. And you see the bottle and the wine itself. If the ice sample's frozen in time, bottled wine evolves. The former is hermetically preserved in ice. The latter is sealed with a cork, a permeable natural and human barrier between today's climate and yesterday's weather. It's a fascinating interplay, mediated, diffusive interplay across time. Cork emits measured amounts of air, catalyzing the wine's aging. And that is that cultural dialogue across time. The ice sample reveals past atmospheric and climatic conditions, while the wine sample, analyzed in the glass, considers how such conditions relate to tradition, creative intent, and legal norms, excuse me, governing taste. In tasting, we can isolate specific climate markers that, in their interaction with human ingenuity, create wine as cultural, environmental artifact. Grapes become wine because of the labor of field workers, viticulturists, harvesters, cellar rats, bottlers, winemakers, and more. It becomes a commodity because it can be stored and traded and more. Langoa Barton is linked to global drinkers through the Place de Bordeaux, a unique distribution system revolving around négociants, distributors, courtiers, brokers, and producers. Courtiers link producers large and small to négociants, who in turn distribute the chateau's wines all around the world. The majority of Bordeaux's producers depend on the Place. Prestigious producers like Langoa Barton also pre-sell through advanced ordering called en primeur. In the spring after harvest, designated tasters, usually noted merchants, négociants, journalists, and critics, sample wines in barrels and publish their reviews. They taste not for the current profile, but for how the wine is going to evolve. They judge its future quality after maturation and bottle and barrel aging. Together, these tasting notes provide a sense of the vintage. It produces the wine as a commodity whose economic value rises and falls with tasting notes about the vintage. As I was working on this essay, I also read negative reviews of the 2024 Bordeaux vintage, characterized by abnormal amounts of rain and all kinds of other climate effects. Langoa Barton and other prestigious producers dropped their vintage 2024 prices by an astounding 20 to 30%. Colin Hay, a veteran Bordeaux wine taster and writer, wrote in his vintage notes, quote, "This year's form of climate weirding has proved particularly intense and particularly challenging." Drawing from that idea of climate weirding, I'm arguing that vintage is a laboring encounter with climate in cultural and sensory dialogue with the past. Thus, a wine that is, in its phenolics and structure, vastly divergent from previous bottlings is a data point in climate crisis. But now, Let's think about how to taste the future because climate weirding makes us taste differently. We would all recognize that a cork stoppered wine is, as I suggested, different from a core ice core sample, even if you accept my premise that they're in dialogue. Vintage needs theorizing in the concept of climate change as a way of engaging with change over climate time. That is, a multisensory environmental engagement. Climate change forces us to recognize how much we depend upon constancy, or at most, slow evolution in our taste, the chocolates of our youth, family recipes, and more. Climate befuddles all that, leaving us to confront the discomfort of tasting forward, dislocated, disoriented, disordered by the rapidity of sensory change. Tasting the future is a new phenomenon, I'm suggesting, one that comes with climate change as opposed to the almost nostalgic past tasting. It engages the possibility of taste extinction. Bordeaux might still be able to ferment grapes in 2050, but that future wine represents sensory rupture. Let's turn now to another prestigious chateau, this one, La Chateau La Tour Carnet, which has been producing wine since the 12th century. Today, its wine owners are testing whether traditional Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot still can produce vintage 2050. As a test, they recently planted a plot, a Bordeaux 2050 plot, and you see its picture there, with a range of varietals. They artificially exposed the vines to higher temperatures and different conditions, those forecast for mid-century. Then, they vinified and tasted the final wine. Sensory eco-criticism thus meets both economic imperative and climate activism. The similarly named Bordeaux 2050 project, launched by the French Association for Journalists for the Environment, AJE, also pre-produced vintage 2050. Simulating projected future climate conditions, the project vinified, then tasted a future wine, and they published their notes. The wine was full-bodied and tannic, but without the complex flavor of today's and yesterday's wines. From the perspective of food studies and sensory studies, wine is particularly useful. It tastes so good, it makes our jobs worthwhile, and wine grapes are so important globally. The wines they produce define status, even if the sensory fragility is the stuff of a completely different talk. Wine is also one of those places where the intimacy of people and their commodities, their plants and their foods are so entwined. The sample produced by the AJE was technologically wine, but in taste, it wasn't Bordeaux wine. Wine tasting has been backwards looking, the evaluation of one vintage after another. As eco-criticism, it can offer up the senses for imagining wine futures or extinctions. It transforms the ways in which we taste, engaging the idea that the distinctions between weather and climate, that weather is something temporary and climate is long-term, is breaking down. We don't experience weather anymore. We experience climate. This approach to tasting recognizes that change over time is both grape phenology, its annual cycle of bud burst, fruit set, veraison, and harvest. It relates that to the climate curve, as those cycles of phenology are themselves changing. In wine as natural production, time has become a measure of both grape ripening and carbon emissions. And what we've seen in Bordeaux, as in many other places in the world, a compression of the harvest season. The samples produced by the AJE and La Tour Carnet was technologically wine. It had alcohol, it had tannins, it had flavor compounds. But in taste, they were not Bordeaux wine. They were no longer in dialogue with past expressions. Typicity is another concept, an important one, and one that I don't have the time to go into today, but is also the kind of thing that is so central to the practice of wine tasting, and one that is as well breaking down. And as it breaks down, it demands an eco-critical theorizing. Imagining future vintages, pre-tasting, if you will, considers whether climate change means that future bottles can no longer engage with past expressions. Climate change, then, as sensory cultural rupture. Wine tasting has been, in the past, backwards looking, the valuation of one vintage after another. We, in tasting, will set up a vertical tasting, for example, tasting wines from one vintage after another to get a sense of changing expressions, good years, bad years. That process now is changing where we now have to think about relationships to future bottles. As eco-criticism, tasting can offer up the senses for imagining wine futures or wine extinctions. Traditionally, vintage variation was understood and taught within wine curriculums as normal fluctuations in temperature, rainfall, and sunlight. And I've argued elsewhere that if we taste the same way that we have before, understanding vintage variation as simply a slight variations from a constant norm, then tasting as labor process becomes implicated in a political climate denial. Instead, if we taste and call out riper, fuller bodied wines from former cool climates and higher alcohol elements from warmer areas, I'm going to suggest that vintage, theorized this way, is not a reflection of seasonal weather, but a record of long-term environmental shifts. And it's in this way that we can reimagine the sensory evaluation of wine as eco-criticism. And I want to conclude by just looking at the AJE's really quite beautiful presentation of Bordeaux 2050. And it's one that's worth looking at, integrating into classes, and you can see the ways in which they, in their presentation, the accompanying YouTube video that they created, the ways in which they were using taste to make a journalistic intervention. And I'll leave it there, leaving us plenty of time, I see, for questions.
Thank you very much. So I suggest we take like 3-4 minutes of break so people can get a glass of wine or coffee, and then we come back and reconvene with the Q&A. I was wondering, in the meantime, could you show us again the photo with the lines of the rows of grapes that are experimenting with?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this one here, this one, this let's see. Am I sharing it? Does that work? Can you see
No,
it?
no, no.
Oh,
I think you have to share again.
oh, hang on. Um, um, Give me a second here. Share PowerPoint. There we go. This here.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I could not.
Yeah, so this one you can see, I have to get a little bit closer, you get to see it close on my face there. You can see one of the things that's happened in Bordeaux is is they have been slowly experimenting with permitting varietals that have no traditional base in Bordeaux and even in France. I think they're allowing, you know, a range of grapes, including Spanish grapes, to be grown there, recognizing what
Between, I
climate
cannot read
features
between Grenache and Syrah is it's Mourvèdre, right? For the Mourvèdre?
Mourvèdre, yeah, which we associate with the Rhone, right?
Yeah, yeah,
With
yeah,
the
yeah.
much warmer climate Rhone, and you can see Tourigo Nacional is there, which is a Portuguese grape, right? Like it shows up in a lot of Portuguese wines, including in port. You can see Tempranillo is there. Can't read
With
some of the next ones, but Nero d'Avola, which we associate with Sicily. You can see that they're and um, Fair Severadu, which is in southwestern France, and a range of different grapes that have no tradition in Bordeaux at all. Basically, just to think about what can grow there in the future, and I think some have seen that Patrick as a as a kind of climate adaptation, and what I'm suggesting is that yes, there is something, there's a certain amount of ingenuity and adaptation and flexibility, and I wouldn't take away from that, but we also need to recognize that as a kind of as a rupture. And unless we readapt wine tasting to that, then that rupture simply festers in our cultural experiences. Shall I leave that up in case others want to
yeah,
look at
yeah, yeah. I
it?
just want to because they're doing the same thing also in Switzerland. I was just checking.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's going to be the case across
Yeah.
across Europe. But there's also a cost there, right? Like,
Kind of
if you
funny that
own
they also have Pinot Noir, you know. I
Yeah,
can
I
tell
mean
you
I
what's going
think
to
I
happen
think
with this one from here, you know.
yeah, I mean that's I'd like to ask them why they decided that they were going to try and grow Pinot Noir, because if you can't grow Cabernet Sauvignon, you really can't grow Pinot Noir, but I don't know.
That's very funny.
Um, but it's I think the fact of these vines on Bordeaux soil is is in and of itself
No, no, of course.
climate
I
crisis,
mean,
is environmental crisis, right?
in France, you know, and you see things like Mourvèdre, you know, they've been getting rid of hectares of Mourvèdre in the last, I don't know, 50 years, and now it's getting back. So people mostly finding it cool.
Yeah, and I think people will because it's a fairly adaptive grape, right? Like, and it does well in hot climates, and it doesn't need the same kind of tender loving care that Cabernet does. I suspect we're going to see a lot more of it. But the cost, when you think about, again, time, the amount of time it takes to grub up a vine, buy new vines, plant those vines. It's a decade, really, before they're producing good grapes.
Okay, I'm
There's
sorry, I cut you here because we have to open discussion and Q&A, so
Yeah,
maybe
please, yeah.
don't want to hijack the conversation. Okay, if people are back, um, they're all at the bar. That's what happened. Um, there are two options for questions. You can either virtually raise your hand, or you can also write a question in the chat if, for whatever reason, that's more comfortable with you. Anybody wants to start? Elizabeth, you are welcome to start.
Great. Thanks so much. Good morning. I'm also on the West Coast, so I have morning voice and morning face, so I'll be camera off. But thanks so much, Dan. Really appreciate this talk.
Hey, thanks for showing up, Elizabeth.
Definitely. I'm curious if you could expand a bit more on either your, as your bio mentioned, your WSET training or your process of the tasting notes. As I think what's so interesting is that you're pointing out multiple technologies and kind of
Hmm.
mediations in this process, which I think, eco-criticism at its best really takes seriously. So I'm curious how you might talk through a little bit more some of this like convergent zone of the future thinking technologies that are happening in the vineyard and where that's going to shift some of those technologies of taste. And I'm even just imagining, right, like what has to change in our mouths, further that might, we might show some fractures in the WSET logics as well, or how you're seeing that as one who's gone through the training, or not. Maybe it's still an effective technology. So
No,
either way, but that's my
absolutely.
offering to think through. Thank you.
I really love the question, and it's been one that's very, very much on my mind. So much on my mind that I'll probably give you a fractured answer, but let's give it a shot. Um, it's so much part of. I mean, I just set out to do the formal wine tasting in a mixture of sort of midlife crisis and maybe look for new jobs and also just an effort to understand the labor process, right? Like I was trained as a labor historian and really wanted to engage if I was going to talk about wine to talk about the labor process. And one of the things that struck me from the very start is that wine tasting, formal wine tasting, meaning the implicit idea for a goal of reaching an objective conclusion, an objective and reproducible conclusion that can communicate the quality, the nature, the structure, the definition of a wine to somebody else without them ever having even tasted it, like put it in their mouth. That they should know exactly what the wine is going to be like and what its quality should be, and therefore how much they should be willing to pay for it. But my quickly realized early on that this served a political purpose. And the political purpose was that it tuned out marketing, right? Like it tuned out the noise of a label. And I deliberately offer a kind of visual and sonic confusion there. Um, and that was part of why the modern tasting regime emerged in the the 1950s. And here, Jessica, I'm gesturing towards your question as well in the chat. Um, that kind of expertise was an anti-marketing expertise. But the problem is that's really based on a presumption of of um, of constancy, right? And that Bordeaux wine is supposed to taste like Bordeaux wine, and so on and so forth, right? And it also meant that so in the end, where this leaves us as a tasting regimen is that we tasted based on the past. Was this a good expression of Bordeaux? And it also meant that we have no measure to determine distinctions between a wine that is profoundly climate affected and one that shows sensitive, sustainable adaptations, transitions. Among other things, I've asked the people who have actually written the curriculum for the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, which for those of you who don't know, is the big one of the two big tasting regimens globally. And I asked them the question, can you taste sustainability? And they said, no. Like we have nothing in our tasting regimen to determine, to credit, to find the organoleptic traces of environmentally friendly production. And that's an enormous problem And what it means, and I think I'm also referring, Jessica, you'll have to put into the chat whether this speaks to your question as well. It means that the expertise of wine tasting, sensory expertise, has been handed over to the accounting expertise of outside auditors who audit the environmental practices to see whether they can put fancy labels on the back of a wine, the eco labels. What I'm suggesting is that that's a real surrender, and it doesn't take into consideration the cultural impact that happens when we lose tastes.